Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another webinar at the National Library of Scotland. My name is Kenny Redpath, and I'm the Events Officer at the Library. Tonight, I'm delighted to be introducing our first In Conversation event since we started our library webinars. We're joined this evening by Peter Ross, who's here to talk about his new book, A Tomb with a View. And in a couple of minutes, Peter will be in conversation with Dani Garavelli. Peter is an author and journalist. He's a 9 times winner at the Scottish Press Awards and is an Orwell Journalism Fellow. Dani is a freelance feature writer and occasional columnist who writes for publications across the UK. But can I remind you before handing over to Dani and Peter that there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar, so get thinking and just type your question into the Q&A function. We will do our very best to get through as many as we can. But for now, over to you, Dani and Peter.
Hello. Thanks for the introduction, Kenny, and hello, Peter.
Hello.
As a long-standing Taffophile, I am delighted to be speaking to Peter about his book today, which I have read several times now and which is brilliant. But before I launch into the interrogations, let me tell you a little bit about it. Here it is, A Tomb with a View, the stories and glories of graveyards. And it's got such a beautiful cover. So it's got rolling hills and ivy winding around the graveyards and a little fox in the foreground, which to me perfectly captures the appeal of cemeteries. And the book itself, it takes a reader through on a journey through memorials from Greyfriars to Flanders Field. But it's much, much more than a tour of graveyards. It's a profound meditation on love and life and loss. And it's already garnered acclaim from writers including Andrew O'Hagan and Denise Mina, and Hilary Mantel, no less, described it as a considered and moving book on the timely subject of how the dead are remembered and how they go on working below the surface of our lives. High praise from the High Priestess. So Peter, thanks so much for joining us. Have you had a chance to have a graveyard stroll today, or has it been too dreich?
It's been beyond dreich today, really. There's not much weather that would put me off having a walk around in a graveyard, but today I've given it a pass, and I don't even feel guilty about it. It's just it's just dreich plus, you know.
Don't blame you at all. But so lots of people have a fascination for graveyards, right? But your fascination probably started a little younger than most, and you write in the book about how you grew up practically in the old town cemetery in Stirling. Do you think your early experiences there, do you think they influenced your choice of career and maybe shaped you as a writer later on?
I would say so, yes. I mean, it's definitely true to say that I, in part, learned to read by walking in graveyards as a child. I would walk in that old town cemetery in Stirling, where my grandparents lived. I would spend summer holidays there. And some of the graves in there go back to the 15th century. They're fantastic gravestones with kind of carved skulls and winged hourglasses and the like on them. And I remember kind of walking around and touching the stones, touching those skulls, poking my fingers, my wee chubby kid fingers into the eye sockets, and trying to sound out the kind of unfamiliar words on the stones like remembrance and unto, and phrases like suffer little children. You know, what does that mean? So I think it definitely was one of the things, along with maybe like the Bruns annuals and Beatles lyrics, that kind of taught me to read. But also I think it did begin to develop in me at a really young age an interest in narrative, because I think you walk around and you look at these people's names and you wonder about who they were, how they lived and died. And not only that, whether they knew each other. So did this person who was a barber, who is buried over here, cut the hair of this person who lived and died around the same time, who's buried over here? So, you know, what you're building up there is an interest, not just in character, but also narrative and plot. So I think it's true to say that it absolutely did shape me as a reader and as a writer, and probably as someone with an interest in things elegiac also.
Mm-hmm. I mean, all your work's kind of characterised by an empathy for people, so it kind of totally makes sense to me that it would have grown out of an interest in the lives behind the stones, you know.
Mm-hmm.
So there are lots and lots of burial grounds that we could talk about. So, but this is an event from the National Library of Scotland, so should we start with Greyfriars in Edinburgh? And actually, I was at Greyfriars just before lockdown, and I was standing in front of the tomb of George Bloody Mackenzie. Yeah. So it amused me no end to when you described it as, I think it was a malevolent pepper pot. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean,
but anyway, I think you're going to read to us a little bit, are you, about it?
Well, I will do. Yeah, I will do if that's okay. This was actually the Edinburgh chapter was one of the very first chapters that I wrote when I was writing this book. It was actually part of the proposal that we sent to the publisher, asking them to consider this for publication. So I'll read a little bit from the Greyfriars section. I'll read it from the start. On one of those bright, cold Edinburgh days when the sky is by Eve Klein and the skyline, as ever, is by Mervyn Peak, there is no better way to spend one's time than a turn in the city's graveyards. But which? It can be a tricky choice. St Cuthbert's, where Agatha Christie was married and Thomas de Quincey is buried. Canongate, where the poet Robert Ferguson, who died penniless in Bedlam at 23, lies beneath a stone paid for by Robert Burns. No, fascinating though these places are, I would always choose to walk up the cobbled lane off Candlemaker Row and pass beneath the arch of elegant letters which spell out in black iron a single word: Greyfriars. As with much of the city, Greyfriars gives the impression of not being quite real, a set for some film as yet unmade. It brings to mind fictional graveyards of the most atmospheric sort, the tilted stones and glowering skies of James Whale's Frankenstein, the wind howling across the Kent marshes, giving churchyard trees a gallows creak in David Lean's Great Expectations. A row of large and elaborate memorials are built like eerie conservatories into the back of some very old houses which adjoin Greyfriars. The people who live there have their rear aspects partly obscured by these monuments. One kitchen window is hemmed in between two huge vaults, a window box on the sill bright with geraniums, a tomb with a view. I visited Greyfriars on an overcast morning in November with Richard Usher, a tour guide. He was fine company, amiably waspish. He was in his 30s but seemed a later vintage, with an old school manner and an old school tie. He's a member of the family which in the 19th century made millions in whisky distilling and gifted to Edinburgh the Usher Hall, the city's beautiful domed concert venue, on the steps of which Richard now starts his tours. Greyfriars is likely busier than it has ever been, thanks to the Harry Potter tourism boom. J.K. Rowling wrote parts of her novels in the Elephant House Cafe, the rear windows of which overlook the kirkyard. The Elephant House seems always to be busy with Potter pilgrims. Afterwards, some wander among the graves in search of the lair of Thomas Riddle, Esquire, after whom, it is said, Rowling named her character Tom Riddle, the boy who would become Voldemort. Thus, a gentleman who died in 1806 at the age of 72 is experiencing a curious afterlife at the nexus of Tombstone tourism and Potter mania. Now, the Harry Potter connection may be drawing a new generation of visitors to the kirkyard, but there is a particular story with which Greyfriars will be forever associated, and one needn't spend long in the place to hear about it. El Pequeño y Devoto Bobby, a Spanish tour guide with dark curly hair, was standing outside the front of the church waving her arms with a degree of animation quite beyond native Edinburghers, a people who consider a furrowed brow ostentatious non-verbal communication. She was encircled by a large group of Spaniards, oohing and eyeing as the story unfolded. Durante 14 años dormió fielmente en la fría piedra de la tumba de su maestro. At this, there was a little gasp of admiration. And then, as she reached the climax, El perro más amado y celebrado de Escocia, spontaneous applause. The most famous and celebrated dog in Scotland. It could only be Greyfriars Bobby. His story sounded much more exciting in Spanish than it has ever seemed in its rather mawkish English language telling. Bobby's grave, marked by a pink granite headstone, is a shrine. Instead of flowers, people leave sticks, the better for the dog to chase. Whimsy, of course, but there is something moving about that little pile of wood. Bobby's memorial stands on its own, directly in front of the church, separate from the rest of the kirkyard. When Bobby died, the minister at that time would not allow the dog to be buried alongside his master, John Gray, Richard Usher explained. He said that it would be sacrilegious for a dog's body to be buried beside humans. Two women listening in weren't having this. What a jerk, said the younger. Usher smiled at this outburst. He'd heard it all before. The minister, he replied with an air of mild irony, spoke on behalf of our Lord. Listen, said the young woman, the Lord loves dogs. Her name, she told me, is Adriana Calloway. She is an actress and model and the owner of two poodles, Chester and Oliver, who were back home in Cambridge while she visited Edinburgh with her mother, Jane, a professional medium. Not to interrupt your talk, said Jane, but where is the grave that's supposed to have the poltergeist attached to it? Richard Usher, a skeptic on matters occult, waved a dismissive hand. Oh, it's that big mausoleum over there. Adriana and Jane walked off ghostwards. They stopped outside the tomb of Sir George Mackenzie, a former Lord Advocate known as Bloody Mackenzie for his violent religious persecutions. The 17th century mausoleum, which resembles a malevolent pepper pot, is reputed to be the most haunted place in Edinburgh, and a great many people have reported unpleasant experiences in its vicinity. There have been 440 documentations of people being scratched and bitten here, Jane said, peering through a small window set into the double doors. She could sense what she called bad energy, but was sceptical about the idea that a poltergeist was responsible for the attacks. Probably a demon, she sniffed. In any case, the Mackenzie haunting held only passing interest. Jane was here on other business. I have come to see if Greyfriars Bobby is still out there and free him if he is, she explained. Some say they have heard him barking. I'm going to return tonight with some little doggy biscuits. Adriana elaborated. It would be sad if he is still attaching himself to his owner's body and doesn't know he's moved on. He's trapped. He deserves to be at peace. So we're here on mission Save Bobby. This, I think, is one of the excellent things about graveyards. The encounters one can have with the living. You turn up expecting to admire some interesting memorial carvings and somehow find yourself chatting with two perfectly lovely people who have travelled a few hundred miles with the sole intention of assisting a spectral hound. Now, one could mock them, of course. A cheap laugh could be had. Better, though, to take one's cue from the tone of those old stones, the words of love carved by careful hands into granite and marble so long ago. Rest in peace has become a cliche, but its egalitarian message retains real power, especially at a time when tolerance and compassion seem, across the world, under threat. This is what graveyards can teach us: to extend to the living the kindness and respect we lavish on the dead. If he is out there, Jane said, it's time for little Bobby to go into the light.
That's great, Peter. I love the way that you capture people's quirks with affection, and there's lots of bits like that throughout the book. You also write about a different Edinburgh cemetery, Warriston Cemetery, and Rob Reinhardt's attempts to restore it. And that's great, of course, because these places need to be kept safe and preserved. But there's something beautiful, isn't there, about wild, unkempt cemeteries? And I wondered if that's what attracted you to Cathcart Cemetery, which is obviously the cemetery that inspired this book.
Yeah, so I live, for those that don't know, I live basically very near Cathcart Cemetery, and I can see it from the windows of my house. I have a view of the tombs, and I love walking in there. And it's one of the cemeteries that did inspire the book for sure. Probably the experience of being in there so much. And I think, and Cathcart is a grand Victorian cemetery, so it would have been laid out as essentially a sort of pleasure garden. So you could be buried there, and then your loved ones could go and visit you and promenade around the sort of pathways and look at the monkey puzzle trees and stuff. So it was a garden that has become, over time, a kind of wood, because trees have self-seeded. People have laid down holly wreaths at their loved ones' graves at Christmas, and the berries have fallen into the earth, and holly bushes have sprung up. So over time, graveyards that are gardens become woods. And I am very attracted to cemeteries that are a little bit run down. I don't think I'm alone in that. I think this, for a long time, the British people have had a romantic attachment to the idea of ruins. And I think aesthetically, there is something very beautiful in a slightly mournful sort of way about a marble angel that's got a missing wing, or has like ivy creating a sash across the front of her gown. And maybe that's because when you see the architecture run down like that, it expresses something of our own kind of human aging and vulnerability. So we see written onto the cemeteries, the places of death, the kind of living human experience. So yeah, so I am enormously attracted to the aesthetics of old cemeteries. And I think one of the reasons why they've become pretty popular lately, and there's a few reasons for that which we can maybe get into, but one of the reasons is certainly aesthetic, and the fact that you can go there and you can photograph these angels or these old gravestones, and you can put it on Instagram, so you can have the experience and then you can kind of share the experience, and it creates kind of communities of people that love cemeteries, online as well as out in the real world.
Mm-hmm. But there was one particular grave that you stumbled across there, wasn't there, that kind of inspired the whole, that set you off on the train of thinking that perhaps, as you said earlier, graveyards are a repository of stories and therefore worth exploring. Yeah.
In Cathcart Cemetery, yeah. I mean, I hadn't long moved into this house, and I was walking in Cathcart Cemetery trying to find the grave of Stan Laurel's mother. Stan Laurel and his family lived in Glasgow for a time when he was a boy and then into his teenage years. His father, I think, was the manager of the Metropole Theatre. Arthur Jefferson was his name, and his mother, Madge Jefferson, was a music hall star. Maybe star would be overstating it, but she was a music hall performer. And while they lived here, she died and was buried in Cathcart Cemetery. And I was in there looking for her grave because for some reason, the grave at that time was completely unmarked. I had been shown it previously, the spot, by a guy from the Laurel and Hardy fan club called the Sons of the Desert. He'd shown me where it was some years before I lived here. And I was trying to remember where it was. So I was walking in there looking for the spot when I chanced upon another grave, and this was the grave. It said it was sort of hidden within a bush, some ivy growing across it. It was a small pink granite stone, and written on it were the words "Mark Sheridan, comedian," and that he had died in 1918. And I was immediately struck by that because I'd never seen the word comedian on a stone before. I'd never heard of him. So of course I Googled him, and it turns out that Mark Sheridan, a music hall star from the northeast of England, is the reason that we all know the song "I Do Like to Be Beside the Seaside." It was his 1909 recording of that song that made it very, very famous and has become a kind of folk song. And it's actually his voice that you can hear towards the end of the Queen song, Seven Seas of Rye. They've sampled him singing it. So when I found that out, I thought, well, why is that man buried on the hill behind my house? And so I went and looked him up in the Mitchell Library, the big Edwardian library in Glasgow, and looked at the sort of newspaper cuttings of the time. And it turned out, very sadly, that he'd actually taken his own life while on tour in Glasgow. He was discovered in Kelvin Grove Park on a path there with a Browning revolver beside his body. And it was it was a very notorious incident at the time, and there was a court case in relation to it, trying to establish whether it had been suicide or an accident. But it amazed me that I just thought, wow, that's a story. And how many other stories must there be like that in cemeteries and graveyards across Britain and beyond? And that was really the little hollyberry from which the whole book grew.
And of course, since then, in your travels, you discovered many, many more characters and amazing stories, some of them just mind-boggling, really. And perhaps the wildest and most mind-boggling is the story of Phoebe Hessel, eh?
Yeah, Phoebe Hessel was an amazing person, I think. I'd love to have met her. Every time I tell people about Phoebe, they just fall in love with the whole idea of her. She was born in London in the 18th century. And what happened was her she had a sweetheart when she was in her kind of mid-teens, I think. She had a sweetheart who was a soldier, and he was sent off to fight somewhere with the British Army, and she couldn't bear to be separated from him. So what she did was she actually pretended to be a man, and she enlisted in the British Army. And not only did she manage to do that, but she did it so successfully that she spent something like the next 17 years fighting in Britain's wars around the world. And her secret was apparently only discovered when she was bayoneted on some awful battlefield in Belgium. And the army doctor, kind of rushing to tend to her wounds, removed her tunic, and seeing her upper body, realized that she was female, and that the game was up at that point, and she had to leave the army. But what I find remarkable is that, you know, she'd taken this risk and signed up to join the British Army, and she might very well have been killed at a very young age, instead of which she actually lived to be 108 years old. You know, she lived through the reigns of 5 monarchs. I think she was born in the reign of Queen Anne, and she died in the reign of George IV, who actually saved her from the workhouse, gave her a pension, called her a jolly old fellow. And she's buried in the churchyard of St. Nicholas in Brighton, in quite a large grave there that tells something of her story. But I just think she's an amazing character. You know, it's definitely a sort of BBC drama waiting to happen. You sort of expect Sally Wainwright and Saran Jones must surely be on the case with that already. I think that story, and actually the story of Brighton at that time, as it was becoming this kind of fashionable resort, but there was still a kind of military threat just across the water from France. I could see it being a sort of British Deadwood in a way. So I'd like to see that happen.
Landbrit meets Gentleman Jack then.
Yeah.
So we could spend the whole of this time talking about the amazing stories that you unearthed. But the thing I really like about the book is that it's not merely a catalogue of interesting dead people. It's much more about the living, and you've gone to a lot of effort to speak to a lot of different people. But did that make it more difficult to write? Because, you know, you do have to find interesting people who are willing to speak and are also articulate.
Well, I suppose it did make it difficult in that sense of just the logistics of it. But I wouldn't have wanted to write it any other way. You know, it was absolutely I was determined that this wouldn't be a book that just said, here are the 5 most interesting people in this graveyard. Here's the 5 most interesting people in this graveyard, dead people, because you would have ended up with a list of, you know, dead white men, essentially, dead white straight men, in fact. And I didn't want it to be that. I wanted the book to kind of reflect the truth and kind of diversity of the country, and I wanted it to be full of living voices. You know, there's a kind of feeling I have of the kind of dead and the living being really close kin. You know, of there being we're only really ever a kind of fingertip touch away, and so it was important to me that the book felt in a way like a dialogue between the voices of the living and the dead. So so I was determined that I would try to find lots and lots of interesting people to talk to me. And so it wouldn't just be about dead people, and it wouldn't just be me pontificating on like I am tonight. It would be full of like others' voices. So, you know, grave diggers, you know, drag queens, people that have lost people that just love cemeteries. It was really important to me that it would be like that, and then the logistics of that did make it quite difficult, because sometimes you just have a chance encounter with someone, and that can be the best thing. But sometimes, as with, for example, Highgate Cemetery, I spent a lot of time making sure that I would have lots of interesting voices in there. You almost, although it's not fiction, you're almost kind of casting the story, so you kind of try to find out in advance who are the real characters, who are the people that I should be speaking to, who will make every page, you know, go on fire, who'll light up any story in which they appear. So I spent quite a lot of time doing that, and yeah, it made it harder, but I think it made it better too.
Oh, definitely. And I think of the people you interview, I think one of the ones that stands out the most is Bridget, who you met in Sharpham Meadow Natural Burial Ground, because her story is just so visceral and intimate. And I wondered how difficult it was to get her to open up. And also, once you had, how difficult it was to write in a way that, you know, to make sure you got a tone that wasn't voyeuristic or ghoulish. Yeah.
Well, to give people the context for that, I wanted to write about natural burial, because it's increasingly the way a lot of people are choosing to be buried. So natural burial would be where you don't necessarily have a headstone, where you're not necessarily laid to rest in a wooden coffin. It would probably be something like a cardboard coffin or a wicker coffin, where it wouldn't be in a traditional cemetery, but it might be on a hillside somewhere. So I went to Sharpham Meadow Natural Burial Ground in Devon, and the idea was that I would go there on All Souls Day, because on All Souls Day, on the evening of All Souls Day, they have a ceremony there where a lot of the families of people who have loved ones buried there are invited to come along, and they're invited to, if they wanted to speak in the dark with a fire going about the person who they loved. And at the end of it, at the end of speaking about them, I think they put a pine cone coated in some kind of chemical resin into the fire, and it kind of lights up all kind of blue and everything. And I thought it'd be amazing to be able to be there and witness that. It'd be really dramatic. And All Souls Day, of course, is the day in the kind of Christian calendar when the living and the dead are meant to be closest to each other, almost touching, as I was saying. But as it turned out, the British weather got the better of that, and it was far too windy and wet for the event to go ahead. But Bridget Sanders, who had agreed to meet with me on that night, agreed that even though the event wasn't going to go ahead, she would still come to Sharpham Meadow and show me the grave of her husband, and we would talk. Now, her husband was called Wayne, and he had died the year before. He had taken his own life. And so what happened was I met Bridget at the burial ground, and the weather was terrible. It was torrential rain, it was howling wind. and we sat together. We went to Wayne's grave, and she kind of cleaned some of the muck and earthworms and grass away from the little flat stone on the surface. And then we went and sat together in the shelter area, which is just a very simple shelter, open to the elements on both sides, made of like earth and straw. And she told the story of their life together. She told the story of how they met, how they fell in love, the difficulties he had with his mental health. She talked about how he died, although I didn't actually write about that specifically. And she talked about very movingly about his funeral at Sharpen Meadow, and the way in which she had actually once he was buried in a kind of felt cocoon over the shroud. He was taken out to the grave and laid in the earth in that, and then the felt cocoon was taken away, so it was just the shroud that was in the grave. And she herself chose to bury him. She pushed the earth over his body. And it wasn't, I've got to say, very difficult to get her to talk. I mean, I think you maybe know this yourself, Dani. Sometimes people that have had tremendous losses want to talk about the person that they've lost. It all depends on that person's temperament. But, you know, Bridget spoke with such candor and inadvertent poetry and ultimately love about Wayne that it was really one of the absolute privileges of my life to be able to be there sitting with her in a storm, hearing her tell the story about the worst thing that had ever happened to her, but also the best person that had ever been in her life, you know? And then, you know, a couple of months later, I came to be writing that up. And as it happened, it was another storm. I was sitting in my house in Glasgow and there was a storm raging outside. It was January of this year. And I remember like listening back to the interview on the headphones and trying to convey to the readers ultimately, not just what she was saying, but what it all meant, and also something of just how it felt to be there in that moment, just the sheer intensity of it. And I found myself after I had written it really shaking. Like, I'm not even quite sure what that was. I've written, I mean, I'm a journalist, and I've covered really difficult stories and spoken to people about some terrible things that have happened in their lives. And I think when you're a journalist, although you can empathize with people, there's also a bit of you that's kind of detached and you do the job. But with this, it was unbelievable. It was like being a conduit for something, really. There was almost no gap between the words appearing in my mind and kind of coming through my fingers onto the page. And you don't often get experiences like that, I think, in writing, and that was one of them. So it was an absolute privilege to be able to have the experience, but also to have the experience of writing it and trying, for everyone's sake, including hers, to do it as well as possible.
It certainly comes across, you know, the power of that definitely comes across. It's a hugely powerful and an emotional thing to read, I think. I'm wondering, you know, a lot's changed, hasn't it, since you were writing the book? So I think you finished just as lockdown started, didn't you? Does that change your attitude, your feelings towards the book? And do you think it's changed people's responses to it as well?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I finished writing this book on March the 1st, right? And I think it was 11 days after that I feel everything changed, because that was the day when the Prime Minister made his statement to the public, that extraordinary statement to the public, when he said, you know, many more people are going to lose loved ones before their time. So I was writing, I'd written a book that was almost taking almost at a theoretical remove from the idea of death. And suddenly we were in a situation where I, as a writer, and everyone that was going to read it, was the idea of loss and death was going to be absolutely all around us every day for a prolonged period. And I did think, you know, should I go back and rework some of the book and maybe talk to some of the funeral directors about how they are experiencing the coronavirus crisis and so on. I chose not to do that. I wrote an author's note that tried to sum up some of my feelings about this. But certainly what I found in terms of, you know, how the book has been received, I do feel, because I think it's been a bit of a slow burn, this book, but I think that a lot of the people that have read it have had a really intense emotional reaction to it. And I think that's because all of the kind of themes of the book, which are to do with life and death and love, most of all, and loss and solidarity and the need for community and human connection, those things have been so alive in the world and in all of our minds and hearts over the last few months, that I think the book, inadvertent though it is, has been tapping into that. So I think it has had an impact on how it is being read. Sure, I feel like it's kind of, you know, arrived at the right moment. Not in any, I don't mean that in any kind of crass commercial sense at all. I mean more, sometimes the book people need turns up at the time they need it. And I think for people that have read it so far, it might be that. And I think for me as a writer, you know, I think I've worked a lot of these things out in the year that I wrote it. And so maybe my, you know, it's shaped my kind of emotional mix at the moment.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's anything but bleak, even though some of the subjects we've covered have been bleak. And I know that, you talk about it being a book about love. You end it, don't you, on something that's very positive and upbeat, and is about love. In Arnos Vale Cemetery, was that quite important to you too, to end on a kind of life-affirming note? I always had
an idea that I'd end the book on a wedding. You know, I went to 4 funerals. I wanted to go to a wedding, and I like the idea that you can get married in a cemetery. That tickled me initially, right? And I thought, well, that'll be a light note on which to end this book. You know, this book's gonna have some sad things in it. Let's end it on a hoolie, you know? Is that the right word? Anyway, I decided to go to Arnos Vale Cemetery in Bristol, where they have weddings. They offer weddings as part of a range of different uses that they put that cemetery to. The wedding planner at Arnos Vale is a woman called Buffy, which just tickled me even more. And I was lucky enough to be allowed to go to the wedding of a couple who were getting married on Halloween last year, called Liz and Sean. And so I kind of, as I say, the way I planned this was, it'll be something lighter to finish on. And it is, but it's more meaningful too, I think, because when I got there, I realized that this was really the kind of the thematic culmination of everything that I'd been writing about. You know, they got married in an outdoor venue up at the top of the hill, and they walked down to the place where they're going to be having their reception, which is one of the old chapels, through a kind of pathway through the woods lined with old gravestones. And they stopped for a moment at the bit where ashes are scattered, because Liz's grandmother's ashes were scattered there. So her and her mum stopped for a moment, and they looked in that gate, and they had their thoughts, you know, they had their moment with the woman who couldn't be there. And then Sean and Liz came down in front of the chapel where they're going to be having their reception, and their friends, their guests, formed an honor guard, right? They put their arms up in the air, and Sean and Liz kind of walked down that path between them, and the friends threw confetti on them. It was rose petals. These rose petals, I watched them. They fell through it was getting dark. They fell through that twilight. They passed them. They've passed Liz's green wellies. She was wearing green wellies with her white dress. They passed Sean's lovely brogues that he was wearing with his blue tweed suit. And they drifted in the wind onto a gravestone at the side of the path of a Victorian couple. And that was when it really struck me that confetti in a graveyard is absolutely the symbol on which this book rests, because it's about love, isn't it? That Victorian couple, they had their marriage, they had their life together, they had their love together, and now it was Sean and Liz's turn to have those things, and so it will go on. And it's symbolized by the wedding ring, it's symbolized by the confetti in the graveyard, And ultimately, just like the whole of this book, essentially, it's about love. So that was how I decided to finish it.
It's a perfect ending, and I wish I'd been there, but then obviously we kind of were, because you describe it so beautifully. I could go on chatting to you, but I think I'm just wondering if we should be looking at questions.
Yeah, I'd be happy to answer some questions if people have some.
Dani, if you want to just go on for about five minutes more, and
Sure,
then we'll open the floor to everybody that's put some questions in. Fascinating. It's made me smile so much, Peter, of Buffy the Wedding Planner. That is gold dust. I love that. But over to you again, Dani.
Okay. So I suppose one thing that interests me about, I mean, that was very tasteful, obviously, but there's a huge boom in Tombstone tourism, isn't there? And at Cathcart, there's now a Google app, and you sometimes see, as you said earlier, people going around and taking the photographs. Is it hard, do you think, to strike a balance between promoting and preserving a cemetery and commodifying it, like especially in bigger cemeteries like Highgate, or where there are burials ongoing?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a taste issue, isn't it? And it's to do with, I think, probably how recently, in terms of visiting graves, or like showcasing graves as part of a tour or online or something like that. You know, I think it depends probably on how recently the person died. So at Highgate Cemetery, for example, you know, you can Highgate Cemetery in London, which is, I think, probably the most famous cemetery in the whole of the UK and probably the world. Probably not the world, actually. I would say Père Lachaise in Paris pips it into second place, but certainly in the UK, Highgate's the preeminent cemetery, and it shapes our ideas, I think, of what a Victorian cemetery looks like. So in Highgate, you can kind of wander into one half of the cemetery. You can pay your £4 and you can wander in and visit the tomb of Karl Marx and, you know, lots of other, you know, famous names. On the other side of the cemetery, the west side, you can only go in there by guided tour, or at least it was that way when I went there. I think they're maybe looking at shaking that up a little bit. And the guided tour will show you, you know, the graves of Michael Faraday, you know, for example. But what it won't show you is the grave of George Michael or Lucian Freud. You know, you can certainly go and look at you know, George Eliot, but not George Michael. And I think that's because, you know, his family still visit that grave. So I think there is a kind of balance to be struck between how one does kind of showcase the cemeteries, and also, you know, how you use them as well. You know, like Arnold's Vale have film screenings and theatre productions and things like that. But I think you just got to kind of feel your way into it. I mean, these places need to make money. That's another thing to say about this, because, you know, often they're very run down, and if they don't have money spent on them, they'll reach a sort of tipping point at which they're just, you know, they're just absolutely in ruins. They're no longer picturesque ruins. They're just falling down. So these places do cost a lot of money to keep up. And so people do need to raise money somehow. But I think, yeah, you need to be careful about how you do that.
There's one tour that particularly stands out for me, and that's the Queerly Departed tour by Son of a Tutu, and I think that's Brompton, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's Queerly Departed is a tour run by an organisation called Cemetery Club in London, and they run sort of interesting tours of a number of different London cemeteries, and I think possibly in other cities as well. But the idea behind Queerly Departed is that it's taking people to visit the graves of people who are known to be or are thought to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, and so on, even though they might not have used that language to describe themselves in their own lives. And when I went there in London on the Cemetery Club tour, it was the evening before Pride, and they had Son of a Tutu, who was this British Nigerian drag queen, to sort of give us a song at the start of the night's events. And it was just a really kind of interesting way to kind of a sort of a way in to looking at some very interesting lives. And they did say that it wasn't about outing people posthumously. It was about being able to show people in all their complexity, in a way that might not have been possible during their own lifetimes, because homosexuality was illegal. They might have been persecuted or shamed for it. But now, after death, we can say, well, we think this person was interesting in this way as well. So yeah, it's really worth them. If people are ever in London, I do recommend they check out Cemetery Club and maybe go on one of those tours. I'll maybe give you a wee bit from that chapter if you want. Do you want a wee bit from? Sure. I'll tell you about just one of the people who I really liked in Brompton Cemetery. The Marchesa Louisa Casati, who apparently put Lady Gaga to shame, they say. This is just a very short piece from that chapter, just to tell you a bit about her, a little taste. The Marchesa was a socialite, bohemian and muse, an Italian heiress who came to live in London later in life, in debt and in decline. She had been famous for her outrageous life and clothes. One outfit, created by the costume designer of the Ballet Russe in 1922, was made of electric light bulbs and came with its own generator. She swathed herself in fabulous rumours. It was whispered that she owned wax dummies in which she kept the cremated remains of former lovers. She elevated hedonism to the level of poetry, putting the cadence into decadence, the verse into perverse. She was death-tinged, doom-fringed. Cadaverous is the adjective most often used to describe her appearance. In Paris, she was known as the Venus of Père Lachaise. She wore necklaces of live snakes. She wanted to be a living work of art. She died of a stroke in the summer of 1957 at the age of 76 and was buried with a pair of false eyelashes and a taxidermied Pekingese. Among the mourners arriving from Venice was her personal gondolier, Louisa Casati.
Every time I hear her read that, I just wish I'd known her. Although I think she might be a bit intimidating, don't you?
I think she had her moments. Yeah, I think she could be quite a tricky customer.
So you must have, in all this time thinking about graveyards, have pondered what you'd want for yourself when the time in the very far future comes. I mean, I know I want to have a lair with a stone just so I can guilt trip my kids into coming to visit me. But what would you fancy?
Well, I mean, I kind of come and go on this, you know. I mean, because obviously I've travelled around looking at lots of different types of burial, and it's a bit like going to a car showroom. You see all different sorts of vehicles, and you wonder what you want. I quite like the idea of the grand Victorian style memorial with the weeping angels and all that kind of thing. But there's also a part of me, the kind of more environmentally friendly part of me, that's really drawn to the idea of natural burial, just being buried under the, you know, on a desolate hillside somewhere with nothing but a chucky stain to mark the place. So I think it probably depends on whether it's the kind of egomaniac or the eco warrior that sort of wins out towards the end of my life, which, you know, I appreciate the caveat that you said in the question. That'll depend on those things as to what I actually have, I think.
Tons of time to reflect on it.